From the Folger Shakespeare Library, this is Shakespeare Unlimited. I'm Farah Kareem Cooper, the Folger director. Shakespeare is endlessly adaptable. With a few costume choices and a fresh backdrop, directors can turn a 400-year-old play into a contemporary satire or political commentary. Dress up Othello in fatigues or Julius Caesar in a suit and tie, and you've given the audience a new way to understand a familiar character. You may also have set off a controversy. Nan Z teaches literature at Johns Hopkins University. Da has written an original and deeply personal interpretation of King Lear. In her new book, The Chinese Tragedy of King Lear, Da draws analogies between the play and her own family's experience living under Chairman Mao. In her telling, Shakespeare's tragedy anticipates the authoritarian horrors of the 20th century. Reading her book, you could easily imagine a director staging Lear with this fresh cultural context in mind. Here's Barbara Bogave in conversation with Nan Da.
When did it first occur to you that King Lear lines up in some way with Maoist history and your own family's experience of it?
Well, I was taught the most curious part of Lear in college by a professor at the University of Chicago. And he had pointed out to me what I say in the introduction, which is that there's something wrong with the division of the kingdoms. It's wrong in so many ways, but practically speaking, for the ordinary person, one can see that it doesn't make sense to ask a buzzer beater question and then take the answers in order of seniority. Or, it doesn't make sense to give out the award 1/3 at a time if the amount is contingent on, relative value. So that got me thinking, and, in Chinese poetic practice and cultural practice, there's this art of finding a match for something. So, in a duilian, which is a type of couplet, you're given the first line of the couplet, and then you have to come up with the second line of the couplet. And the second line has to be, each character in the second line has to match its corresponding character in the first line. So, this is an art form that I'm familiar with, and I thought I was finding a match here.
In part, you make the point that Lear is perhaps a good match because you say that Lear is the most Chinese of Shakespeare's plays. So in what ways, though, beyond the obvious theme of say, filial piety, is Lear the most Chinese of Shakespeare's plays?
I think we can begin with filial piety, even though that seems like the most obvious. When matters of this state are so conflated with matters in the home, it feels familiar because it triggers a kind of Confucian sensitivity. And I take pains to clarify what that might mean to rescue Confucius from the bin of ridiculous philosophy. But what I mean when I say that it triggers Confucianism is the play understands that wrongness is stitched into every layer. So if there's wrongness in the level of the state, there's going to be wrongness in the home, wrongness in every interaction, not just between characters, but in the words themselves.
So it is on many levels. And you say this kind of Chineseness of Lear begins right from the moment go with this unfair division of the kingdom. But help us understand that. How so?
It is usually restaged as a parable of authoritarianism. That makes sense. And it's usually restaged as a parable of fascist authoritarianism, which sort of makes sense. But there's a kind of pettiness and passivity, attention-seeking that grounds it in an authoritarianism with which I'm more familiar.
That's interesting because I'm thinking, okay, in the beginning, Lear is almost kind of bluffing with this gambit to make his daughters say how much they love him. And and Cordelia doesn't follow through. So in the analogy, is Cordelia like a citizen of an authoritarian regime who just refuses to flatter the tyrant, to play the game?
Yeah, and she's historically been seen as that figure, as a real Parisiatic figure, someone whose willingness to speak truth to power is verified by the fact that she has much to lose. And in China, she's usually seen in that role.
Is Cordelia a common trope or character in Chinese tales and romances and tragedies?
Well, that's a good question. I think because there isn't this parallel story, if you will, of the birth and death of Christ, which I think is there in Lear and in sibling plays and Cymbeline, for example. Cordelia as a kind of archetype works differently in Shakespeare than the way that she shows up in Chinese iterations. But I think that there's that figure of the young woman who speaks a courageous truth is there. And also, I mean, more importantly than that is the young woman who's wronged even as she's speaking this courageous truth. One of my favorite Shakespearean scholars, William Empson, emphasized that Cordelia said nothing. And it's not true. She mends her speech.
Well, you trace so many parallels between what happened in China in the 20th century to what happens in Lear. You have a plague, a regime change, political paranoia, persecutions that were religious and theatrical in nature, to use your language. And some of the examples you raise they come from your own family's history. And I'd like you to tell us about the road that your grandfather built, and then how it figured later in his re-education.
Yeah, it was just one of those, shovel-ready ironies. But my paternal grandfather was a, low-ranking communist administrator, worked really hard. My grandmother as well. They were both types who connected to Maoism to the end. Mm. My grandmother would say that azaleas don't usually bloom twice in the same season, but they bloomed twice when Mao died. So just to give you a sense of how irrational and how deep that love is. But yeah, my grandfather, he oversaw the building of a road in his county, a road that he later crawled on. Willingly, a lot of this punishment was self-designed, and people had a sense of poetry even in their absurd punishments that they designed for themselves. The nature of the punishments in Lear are cruelly poetic, so there's something about bringing the body down to its most base form that reminded me of the relationship between the two situations.
I think it also prompts you to see Lear as a romance, a love story. And as you said, the great love that your parents and your grandparents' generations had for Maoism, some to the end, is all part of that understanding.
Yeah, I think Lear's Shakespeare's most romantic play. The anonymous 1606 Lear is already very romantic. As I say in the book, there's that beautiful line where Edgar espies Cordelia and finds himself caught in a labyrinth of love. That kind of romance is somehow retained, even though there's no romance left in the play. It's the most romantic, romanceless play. It's that beseeching love.
And how does it apply to your life? Because you were born at the tail end of this history that you draw parallels with. But what parallels did you experience before your family immigrated to the U.S.?
Well, as I say in the book, it was a very Shakespearean moment because I couldn't quite figure out if I could say that things were bad or not. It's both this Renaissance and we're still rolling out from the depths of despair, and people had Learian dispositions.
In what way?
In the need for flattery, for excessive amounts of flattery. for flattery to govern every interaction. And I will say that pathology is there in Chinese culture to begin with. We don't need, Maoism to activate it. But I think that there was something unnatural about the amount of, I suppose, insecurity that subtended human relationships.
And you also tell a story about how deep the punishment and reward system goes. I think it's from your kindergarten experience.
Yeah, we were, they were trying so hard. There were leftover things from this kind of Soviet system. I had these very punishing calisthenics classes. But yeah, they were trying very hard to move towards liberality. But yes, the punishments that were doled out to children even then were quite severe. Quite a bit of humiliation and quite a bit of not rewarding the best answer, of stifling the best answer, creating the psychodrama of collective punishment. It was bleeding out, but it was still there.
I'm just picturing thousands and thousands of Cordelias as you talk.
And thousands of Gonerills and Reagans.
Yeah. When and how did you first encounter Lear when you were growing up in China?
The version that I had gotten a hold of was, a kind of a paraphrased version. And it was Lear collected with many other types of stories from around the world, like Rikki Tikki Tavi and Bluebeard.
Oh.
Yeah, so it was completely out of place, But Shakespeare, in a way, disappeared from China. Well, that's not quite true, because there were Shakespeare plays put on, even during the Cultural Revolution. But there's a memory of Shakespeare that had disappeared, and those certain Shakespeare plays were allowed, and of course, only certain versions of them or certain interpretations of them. Lear was, I don't know if it was Lear was disallowed, but there's a particularly harrowing story of a professor at Beijing University who tried to put on Lear. He was punished later, maybe not just for Lear, but as I say in the book, there's just something inherently subversive about the play. You can't get around it. There's no adaptation, however sycophantic, of any regime that can get around the fact that what's being done and asked for is illogical.
Illogical, and also it's elders being dishonored by their children, and also a ruler being brought low?
Yeah, that's right. In Chinese culture, of course, there's great worry about the circumstances under which it would be permissible to dishonor your elder, because it is so sacred. In post-Maoist China, the problem was that, elders or bodies of authority, were not reliably authoritative. So that you can imagine the kind of confusion that grows when there's, there's a kind of inherent skepticism towards subversion, not because people are obedient, but because Chinese people understand that subversion can, many people can imagine themselves to be Cordelias. And many people can imagine themselves to be speaking truth to power when in fact they're just disrespectful. It makes the situation more poignant, I think.
Well, I'm thinking Shakespeare wrote Lear in a very chaotic time. It was during the plague and during a time of regime change and rising witch hunts and paranoia and superstition. And, of course, the play is generally seen as a historical commentary, a tricky one, as you write. So what resonance with China do you see in that setting and Shakespeare's handling of it?
I think it's interesting that we forget that 1606, 1607 is, the chartering of the Virginia colonies. When you have that perspective, it becomes easier maybe to understand how bad things got. I do think Shakespeare had it easier. That is, as precarious as Jacobean England was, early rule of James I, it wasn't so bad that he couldn't smuggle things into his plays. So in that way, the situation is more felicitous than it is in China. But that drumbeat feels the same of paranoia and persecution, especially after the gunpowder plot.
Because of all of this, you write that Lear anticipates totalitarianism, specifically how tyranny always catches you by surprise, even though there's so many indications of it. But your grandfather in particular experienced this firsthand. He wrote a memoir, and he sounds like he felt he was a frog in a pot of slowly heating water in the 1950s. That as you live, I mean, it's always, I guess, the case with history, as you don't think you're living history as you live it. You're just in the present. But as you live your days, you can't see all the signs of tyranny, and then all of a sudden it smacks you in the face.
Yeah. He had a great memory. And I think even he struggled with the inanity of it. Part of what's hard to remember is that it's stupid. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, like, extremely stupid things are very hard to remember, I think. Things were becoming conflated, right? So your social circle was becoming exactly the same as your professional circle, was becoming, the exact same thing as your political circle, and so forth. So it was an all-around narrowing, or maybe stacking is the better word, of many things becoming one type of thing. But it was mission creep. It was very slow.
And bringing it back to Lear, mission creep, how do you, could you talk more about what you mean by it anticipates totalitarianism, and what you write about the simultaneous slowness and quickness of terror?
Maybe it's just me, but I didn't see Gloucester's blinding coming,
Well, I think that's by design. I mean, it's so shocking, right?
It's so shocking. Yeah. I mean, it's not like you're not given enough hints, but Cornwall, promises to do something terrible and sends Edmund away. But the mood is confusing, because in a sense, the mood is still people showing up at other people's houses. It's like, I thought we were in the genre of people showing up at other people's houses and getting turned away.
And all of a sudden, someone's eyes are plucked out.
Yeah, exactly. What happens to Kent is similarly confusing. It feels like slapstick, and all of a sudden it's quite severe and cruel.
And did your grandfather give examples of that in his memoir?
Oh, no, he couldn't do that. So that's the other problem, is that once you finally remember it, you can't even say it. So you have to you can only use, distant euphemisms. As I say in the book, the severest thing he said about Mao is that he didn't really care for him. And you imagine that as the only thing you could say. So his book has also just disappeared from all Chinese libraries, all databases. It's not even that subversive, and it's gone.
I mean, you can speak out, and where you see the analogy between Lear and the Chinese state really in high relief is when you describe Mao's great leap forward in the mid-20th century, and when the agrarian reforms backfired and mass starvation set in. And you discuss what happens when rulers are out of touch, just what they're capable of when their folly catches up with them.
It never really caught up with Mao. It's fascinating that this tragic law has not been completed. But, in Chinese literary and cultural tradition, there's, like I said in the book, the genre of the sovereign dressed in plain clothes, seeing everything that is wrong with his country, information that he could never access by virtue of being the emperor. So, but that never happened during the Great Leap Forward. That kind of reckoning never came, because the amount of work that people were willing to do to cover up the folly was historically unprecedented. So Mao does go to the countryside, but he doesn't even do what Lear does, which is to say that I've taken too little care of this. So it's worse. Right? There's that running joke, if you want to call it a running joke, in the play about what's worse. You can't say it's the worst as long as you can still say it's the worst.
Mm. So, and you say that people were locked in a Learian feedback loop in that time. What do you mean by that?
Then and now. I mean that the thing that abuses you is the only thing that is still left to give you any kind of recognition. Any kind of recognition. So that's why children who have heard from their parents stories about abuses of Chinese communism will still hear from the same parents how lucky they were to have met so-and-so, or to have taken a picture with so-and-so, or they still sing the same songs praising Mao. So it's very, very confusing.
I always understood that as such sacrifice was demanded, and the country went through such pain, and individuals' lives were lost, and people suffered so much that they couldn't give up their love of Mao.
Yeah.
Because then it would all be for naught.
Yeah, it would all be for naught. And the conditions were created for extreme love. So that's where extreme love went. Yeah.
Which is what Lear demands in the beginning of the play.
Yeah. As I say, Lear is still better than Mao. but yeah, there's that, have to confront the fact that in the end, Lear wanted what he wanted. There's nothing you could do to gainsay it. And what he wanted was to be flattered by the person who's least likely to do it. So the emotions are betraying like that. Yeah.
It is, I think, a story of the collapse of the personal and the political. But I think it's a story that you tell in all its particulars. And just to pull out of Lear for a moment and talk about Shakespeare, you write that in the Mao era, Shakespeare became weaponized for class struggle. And what form did that weaponization take?
So among Shakespeareans, those who quickly reformatted their readings of the play to reflect Maoist revolution, the peasant revolution, were survived.
So they were understood as dramas of the collapse of the feudal order? Yeah.
And they're absolutely available for that kind of reading. Just in that by the end of the play, with the exception of Edgar and Albany, everyone has died. And servants are given really interesting roles in Lear. There's a scene that's in the Quarto that actually is cut in the folio where servant number 2 and servant number 3 discuss among themselves the aftermath of Cornwall's blinding of Gloucester. And of course, it's the first servant who takes Cornwall out. So it can be read, I think, very convincingly even to me, as a play about the overturning of the feudal order.
And class struggle, yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it's absolutely there, too. So you can't even say that in a sense, they were wrong. I mean, it's the problem of interpretation.
Another really fascinating personal resonance for you, like it's really about theater, involves your mother and her maternal grandfather, who were Peking opera performers. So how does their story coincide for you with Shakespeare's Lear?
My grandfather acted in so many roles that were Lear-like. And he himself was very Lear-like. There's a saying about Lear, which is that if you're old enough to play Lear, you're too old to play Lear.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather really tested that truth. He would be on stage performing these 4-hour performances. And something that you have to understand about Peking opera is it's extraordinarily painful for the actors. What they're subjected to physically is just incredible, almost needlessly painful.
How so?
So first, in order to get that look of having your face lifted up, it's many, many meters of gauze that's wrapped around your head. so tight that it can cause people to, vomit and faint. Then you have to wear, up to 20, 30 pounds of props. And you have to wear these shoes that are like platform shoes, but worse.
Right, wooden.
Yeah, that are high in the middle. And so the whole thing is so excruciating. You have to be on stage for hours and hours. And he was often acting these roles that took a lot out of you. They were about, elderly men being abused by everyone, from family to country to posterity. So, they're very excruciating to act as well.
And Chinese opera also has fool characters, right?
Yes.
They're
very interesting.
Yeah, how do they compare to Lear's fool?
The idea of jester's privilege must be universal because the fools also exercise it. They're the only ones who can exercise it in Peking opera. But as I say, they pay a physical price for this. I suppose in the way that Shakespeare's fools, some of them pay a physical price. Certainly the fool in Lear pays a physical price. He's unpaid. I think we have to take that seriously. He's unfed.
Yeah. He's out there in the raging wind.
Out there in the elements without supper or breakfast or anything. In Chinese opera in general, the fool suffers by virtue of having to squat the entire time. My great-great-grandmother, my maternal grandfather's mother, was the first female fool in opera history, Chinese opera history, and she would endure these performances, squatting on stage for hours.
Oh. Well, I want to know what you make of the very end of Lear, now that we're nearing the end of the conversation, and the final, Edgar's final pronouncement on it. The oldest hath borne most, we that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long. That, I immediately thought of your China parallels, because the story is one of sacrifice in China, right? The elders, the older generation sacrificed so that you might now have post-Maoist China? What?
Yeah. I think that the story of what those lines mean to me is there's a warning in it. This is a generic good advice or generic profundity about how much the young still have yet to see. I think that the story of Maoism is not finished. It's simply not finished. It's not done yet. So we have not yet seen everything that there is to see.
Well, then, are Lear's themes becoming less Chinese as China modernizes, though, and Chinese people become more capitalist and individualistic?
I think that China is a case where the worst of capitalism and the worst of communism can combine or have and work in tandem with one another. In the book, I talk about the current president of China, Xi Jinping's very Learian family story. His sister hung herself. Her father was denounced, and his mother participated in the denunciation ceremony and in his own denunciation ceremony. So that means that, it just means that it's not done. It's not finished. The fact that he's president, the fact that this happened to him ramifies, has implications for the country. So it's still the same Learian story. We haven't actually exited it yet.
Well, what do they say of Lear? It's a play that encompasses everything, and Chinese history encompasses everything. And thank you so much for trying to wrap your arms around both today on the show.
Thank you so much for your time.
That was Nan Z, interviewed by Barbara Bogave. Da's book, The Chinese Tragedy of King Lear, is available for pre-order now from Princeton University Press. This episode was produced by Matt Frasica. Garland Scott is the executive producer. It was edited by Gail Kern-Pastor. We had technical help from Katie Marquette in Baltimore, Maryland, and Voice Tracks West in Studio City, California. Our web producer is Paula Garcia Acuna. Leonora Fernandez edits our transcripts. Final mixing services provided by Clean Cuts at 3Cs, Inc. If you're a fan of Shakespeare Unlimited, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. While you're there, be sure to hit follow so you get new episodes as soon as they come out. Shakespeare Unlimited comes to you from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection, the Folger is dedicated to advancing knowledge and the arts. The Folger campus on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is open to the public. Come explore our new exhibition halls or watch a performance in our theater. For more information, visit our website, folger.edu. Until next time, thanks for listening.